welcome to Hartford Stitch at Home. I'm Laura Kasowitz. I am the owner and lead teacher at Hartford Stitch, a sewing school for kids and adults right outside Hartford, Connecticut. And now we also have an amazing e-course that's available to you online as well. So today we are going to be making these really fun placemats. I love these not only because placemats make a table look so very cool and pretty, but also because it helps us remember how we're supposed to set the table, which can always be a little bit tricky. These are a great way to use scraps. We're going to learn how to use a zigzag to applique things on. It's just a really fun project to make for yourself, for other people in your family, and to give as gifts. So this is a beginner project, but I do assume you know a couple things already. I assume you know how to measure and cut fabric. I also assume you kind of understand how your sewing machine works. You know how to wind a bobbin, thread the machine, sew a straightish line, how to backstitch, and how to turn corners. If you don't know how to do these things, we do have a Kids Learn to Sew e-course that is available that will cover all of that stuff and way more. Now, I'm going to go through all the steps of how to make this. We don't really go into a lot of why. So if you're someone that likes to know why we do something, again, check out the e-course because there we'll show you how we do it and why we do it. And all those things are so important to really building our skills as sewers. So let's get started on sewing our placemats. Great, so let's start talking about the different kinds of materials that we need for this project. So you have two options when it comes to all the fun features on top of your placemat. One is you can use quilting cotton, and two is you can use felt. Now there are pros and cons to both of them. The pros to the felt is that it's the easiest. Felt is often a little bit thicker than quilting cotton, so it's a little bit easier to handle the pieces once you've cut them, and then once you sew it down, felt doesn't fray, and so you don't have to worry about getting any little threads on your project. However, felt usually just comes in solid colors, and also it's pretty thick, so your placemat's going to be pretty uneven once you get everything on here. Again, not a big deal, but if you don't want that, that would be a problem. So felt is one option. Now, quilting cotton does come in a ton of beautiful colors and patterns, and if you've been sewing or someone in your house has been sewing, you probably have a lot of quilting cotton scraps around, and this is a great scrap project. It does take a little bit more work to get it onto the placemat, and we use another material that I'll go into as well. So I'm going to do mine with quilting cotton. If you want to do yours with felt, that's totally up to you. All right, so before we get to talking about what pieces of quilting cotton we need, I want you to get a ideally lightweight home deck fabric for the back of your placemat. So you can do this with quilting cotton as well. It'll just be a little bit flimsier, and the lightweight home deck fabric will give it kind of like a little more oomph to it, so it'll keep it shaped nicely. And you want half a yard of that. Again, if you're unfamiliar with what these mean between the home deck and the half a yard, make sure you check out our kids e-course video. So on to these fun pieces of quilting cotton. So one thing I want you to keep in mind when you're picking out all of your scraps is contrast. So contrast is when you can really see the difference between two things. I could do a red placemat, but then this one may not pop out as much. Or what if I had picked this fabric as that napkin? Would that fork pop out? Now maybe you're okay with everything not having a lot of contrast, but since this is supposed to help us set the table, I think it's really helpful when you can see the difference between all the different pieces. So with that, I picked this blue and white as my placemat for this project, and for my plate, I picked this orange fabric. Now you're going to want a piece that's about 12 inches by 12 inches square. So I have a fat quarter here, which will allow me to cut a 12-inch by 12-inch square. But if you have a scrap that big, you can definitely use it. Then for my napkin, I picked this one, and you're going to want a piece that is at least 5 inches wide by 10 inches high. All right, so that's how big our napkin will be, 5 inches wide by 10 inches high. And then I have 3 utensil fabrics, so my fork, my knife, and my spoon. And you want a scrap for these that's at least 3 inches wide by 10 inches high. And these can all be the same fabric. They can be different fabrics, whatever you would like, as long as they're 3 inches high by by 10 inches wide. And lastly, if you want to put a little drink spot on your placemat, you want a scrap that is 3 inches wide by 3 inches high. And if you're doing quilting cotton, you also need this fun thing. So this is double-sided fusible webbing. I'll put a link below in the comments of where you can find it. And this stuff is so cool. So basically we ironed it onto the wrong side of our fabric. That's the back side of our fabric. And after it's ironed on, you're able to kind of pull up this paper back. You can see mine's actually starting to split down here. And this is like a glue. So it makes almost like an iron-on patch out of all the pieces that you cut out. It's not a permanent hold. It wouldn't hold up in the wash that well, but it does keep it in place long enough for you to go and sew the pieces on. So once again, you want a yard of this. And of course your thread. So I am picking this kind of dark blue thread this time because it's gonna stand out nicely on all of my applique pieces, partially just so you can see it, but it also is a kind of a fun design technique. So you wanna have a thread and a bobbin with that same thread color in it. And last but not least, you wanna download the pattern off our website. The link is gonna be down in the comments so that you have the shape of the utensils. Now, if you don't have access to a printer, that's totally okay. You wanna make your utensils about 8 to 9 inches, and you can kind of freehand them or trace some that you have at home if you'd like to go that route instead. All right, so that's kind of a lot of different scraps. Pause and take a moment to go see what you have or what you need, and then I'll meet you for tools. Okay, so let's take a moment and talk about the tools you need. So I like to have my clear grid ruler. If you have a school ruler, that works as well. I find this to be very helpful. I also like my trio of scissors. So my fabric scissors for cutting fabric, paper scissors in case we need to cut paper, thread snips, my seam ripper just in case anything goes wrong, my straight pins, a number 2 pencil, some marking tools. I like to use chalk. And then you're also going to want some things to use as a template for your plate and your cup. Now, the easiest thing would be to go down to your kitchen and grab a plate to trace. I forgot mine at home, so I'm using this spool of twill tape instead. And then I have a mug. On top of that, you're going to want an iron and an ironing board or ironing mat. That's really important this project. And of course, you'll also want your sewing machine. So take a moment, make sure you have all of your tools, all those materials we just talked about, and I'll meet you for the next step, which is measuring and cutting. All right, and from that half a yard of fabric for your background to your placemat, you want to cut 2 rectangles that are 15 inches tall by 21 inches wide. And again, if you're not familiar with measuring and cutting, you can check out our kids' e-course video. You're going to want your fusible webbing, your paper scissors, your pencil, and your clear grid ruler. Now, if you're going for felt, don't worry about this. This is just if you're doing the quilting cotton. What you want to do is cut all of these dimensions that you see right here. So we want to have a 12 inch by 12 inch square for our plate, a 3 inch by 3 inch square for our cup, 3 3-inch by 10 inch rectangles for our utensils, and a 5 inch by 10 inch rectangle for our napkin. So take a moment now and cut out your fusible webbing to those shapes. And just as a tip, it's easiest to write on the side that feels papery, not on the side that feels really rough. You'll probably notice that you have a little bit left over at the end. That's on purpose. It's not that we need that right now, but sometimes we do things the wrong way, so it's always nice to have a little bit extra. All right, so now you want to have all your pieces of your double-sided webbing. You want to have your pattern piece printed off. You want your plate, and you want your cup. Now you'll notice this webbing has a rough side and kind of a more papery side. The rough side is actually like a glue that we're going to put onto the back of the fabric. So you want to have the papery side up. And we can start with our pattern piece and our template. So I'm going to place this webbing on top of my fork of my pattern piece. The paper side is up, and using my number 2 pencil, I'm just going to go around and trace the shape. Now I'm going to then use the next piece of webbing for the spoon, the other one for the fork. I'm going to trace out my cup, and I'm going to trace out my plate. So now is a great time for you to pause, catch up, and I'll meet you back once we have everything traced, but don't cut anything yet. Okay, so I've traced everything. There's nothing for me to trace on my napkin, so that one is just left alone. Next up, we're over at our ironing board. So I have my ironing mat, my iron, all of my quilting cotton pieces, all of my webbing pieces, and I also have a press cloth. So a press cloth is any thin piece of fabric. I just have a little piece of muslin here that we can use to protect our iron and protect our project from the glue that's on this webbing. So if you have an extra scrap of fabric that you can use, you want to grab that, or maybe you want to see if there is a cloth napkin or a dish towel in your house that with your grown-ups' permission you could use for this purpose. So before we start ironing, we're going to go over those iron safety tips one more time. All right, guys, so we're about to start ironing. We just have to go over a couple of iron safety tools before we do. Number one is make sure that you always have your grown-ups' permission before you start ironing. Number two is that irons are hot. This metal plate here is the hottest part, so we have to be very careful that we keep our hands way away from that. Number three is that the fabric iron touches becomes hot, and this is the part that people often forget. So after you're done ironing, give it a couple seconds to cool down before you go to pick it up. All right, and number four, the last one, is that we need to store our iron carefully when we're not actively using it. So you saw that I picked up my iron, then I put it down like this, and I let go of it and kind of kept on talking. That's because I have what's called an Liso Smart Touch iron. So when I put my hand on it, that hot plate actually goes down to my mat and I can start ironing. And when I take my hand off, it goes up on these feet, and so it's nice and safe and raised above my mat. Now you may not have this kind of iron at home. You may have to put your iron up on a heel on the bottom when you're not using it so that the plate doesn't burn anything that's on your mat. If you're unsure what kind of iron you have, of course, double check with your grown-up. If you have the kind of iron that has to stand up on its heel when it's done, make sure that that plate is facing away from you, and remember that the plate is still hot even if you're not ironing. All right, so always make sure you're storing your iron in this very safest way possible. All right, so I want you to put your press cloth down on your work surface, and we're just doing this to protect our work surface so that we don't get any of that glue from the webbing on there. And then I'm going to take the square I'm using for my drink, and I'll put it wrong side facing up. So remember, wrong side is the side we don't want to see when we're done. The right side is the pretty side that we do. So we always put our webbing onto the wrong side of our fabric. So I have my wrong side facing up, and then I'm going to take my webbing and I'm going to feel and double check that the rough side is on the back, and I'm going to put it down on top of that wrong side. I'm going to cover my piece with the other side of the press cloth, take my iron and hold it down and count to 10. Now I'm going to speed up this 10, but you want to take a good long 10 seconds. All right, and just like we talked about in the iron safety video, remember that this is a little bit hot here. So be very gentle when you go to pick it up. Okay, I am going to do the same thing with all of my utensils and my napkin and my plate. And of course, don't iron and watch me at the same time. So I'm going to speed on through it. And then when you're done ironing on all of your applique, meet me here. Okay, so you've finished pressing all these on. One thing I want you to check though before we go too far is find a piece and start to peel back the side here. Now if you peel back the side and it's coming off cleanly and the wrong side of your fabric sort of feels almost a little sticky, not sticky like you take your hand away and it would feel weird, but kind of like your finger is kind of not gliding on it very well, and the paper feels nice and smooth, then you've done a really good job and it's nice and fused on. However, if it looks like I have on this side where I have like little spider webs sticking up, sticking my paper to the fabric, that means that you need to press it a little bit more. Or if your fabric feels totally normal, but the back side of your paper still feels a little rough, that means you should press it more as well. Now you can kind of test the size of them right now, or you can wait until after the next step. So we're going to cut out all of these shapes. And there is paper on here, but we are going to use our fabric scissors because it's going to give us the cleanest shape. So I am going to go through and cut out all of them. I want you to pay close attention to how I cut out my fork. I'm going to do that first because getting into those little tines can be a little bit tricky. When I'm done, I want you to pause, cut out all your shapes, and then we're going to start peeling off the paper. So now I have everything cut out and it's time to start peeling off the back. So this can be a little bit tricky and it's helpful if you have some sharp nails. But you want to just very carefully get in between the paper and your knife or whatever you're starting with and start to peel back. And again, if you start seeing those spider webs, you can go back and hit it with the iron carefully so that it really all secures on. Like I'm seeing that this one is already starting to get a little spider webby, so I must not have ironed it enough. So peel, iron as you need to make sure the webbing stays on the fabric. And when you're done with that, move on to the next step. Okay, I'm all done peeling, and you may have noticed that, like I did, that I accidentally cut off a tine of my fork. I somehow missed that. If something like that happens, don't worry about it. Just get a scrap of the fabric that has that interfacing still on it. And I actually am going to peel off that interfacing webbing beforehand so I don't have to do it on a teeny tiny little piece. And I'm going to cut myself just the slightest tip of a fork to make it whole again. And once I sew that all on, you won't notice that there's a difference at all. Okay, so take one of those rectangles that you cut, remember 15 inches high by 21 inches wide, and we're going to start laying out all of our stuff. So our plate is obviously going to go right in the middle, and then our napkin is going to go to the left. Now you want to keep everything about 1.5 inches in from the side. So if you need to grab your clear grid ruler to line it up and just make sure that it's all in there, that is great. And now we want our knife and our fork and our spoon. And this is how I like to remember how it goes. Everything is alphabetical. So first comes the fork, and that's the part that's on the napkin. And I've got to put my little fork bit on there. So A, B, C, D, E, F. The next is going to be your knife because K comes next in the alphabet. And we put on a knife, we always want the blade facing into us and not pointing towards whoever is sitting next to us. That's something that dates back like a really long time ago. And then of course your spoon, which is the last letter in our lineup. So F, K, S. Then you want to take your drink cup. And if you go like this hand looks like a D and this hand looks like a B. So your drink is always going to go on your right hand side. And if we had a bread plate, which we don't, your bread plate would always go on your left hand side. So once you have everything set exactly where you want it to, we're going to head back over to our ironing table. Now these don't scooch around too much because of the stickiness of the webbing. But if you feel like yours is going to scooch, you can just put a pin in the middle of everything so it doesn't go anywhere. All right, once you're all pinned, you can very carefully take this over to your ironing station. All right, so once you're over here and everything is laid out again, you can very carefully remove your pins. Now, if your entire placemat can't fit on your ironing board, then maybe leave the pins on part of it and just unpin what can fit. You're going to take your press cloth, very gently lay it over it because we don't want to shift anything. And then you're going to take your iron, we'll do that 10-second press all the way around just like we did last time. All right, and so when you're done pressing, remember this is still pretty warm, so you want to be careful. So our next step is that we're going to head over to the sewing machine. But before we do that, I want to show you a couple of options on how we're going to sew all this down. Because remember, even though it seems like it's pretty firmly stuck on here right now, put this in the wash a couple times and it's going to start peeling right on up. So there's kind of like 3 ways. So the first way looks like this, and this is the easiest way. This one was actually made with me and my 3-year-old daughter. So by the time we got to this point, she was like, I have no patience for sewing everything on. So we just did these big stitches back and forth just to kind of hold things in place. And we did a few more stitches over the tines. So this is the easiest, and it definitely would go the fastest. However, you can also see that since this has been washed a ton of times, my webbing is starting to come up. Everything is starting to get a little bit fuzzy around the sides. So I'm not sure how much longer this one will last, but it definitely was a fast way to sew it. The other thing you can do is to sew with a straight line just around the outside and to hold everything into place. Now, if you have felt, you can do that and it won't start to fray. If you do it on this one, you will eventually start to get little frays, just like I have here, but they'll only go so far because your line of stitching will be there. If you have tried a couple projects and you're ready for a little bit of a challenge, I suggest that you try this way. So this way, I'm doing a zigzag all the way around, and a zigzag will really hold in all those little frayed edges so that they don't keep fraying on me. They don't keep going anywhere. This takes a little bit more skill, a little bit more patience, because it is a lot of sewing, but it is a really fun thing to try to do. And so this is the way that I'm going to show you over at the sewing machine. So if you haven't pressed everything into place, now is the time to do it, and then I'll meet you back over at your machine. So before we get started, we always go over our sewing machine safety rules. So my number one rule is that this right here is my no finger zone. I don't want to get my fingers inside this square, this metal square called the needle plate, while I'm sewing. And for obvious reasons, right? My needle is inside that. Now, a needle is not a monster. It's not going to jump out and get you. You have to get your fingers in the wrong place if it's going to hurt you. But as long as we keep our hands outside of this square, we won't even be close to it. Number two is that I always want you to watch what I'm doing, pause the video, and then do it yourself. Don't try to sew while you're watching me sew. Otherwise, you're kind of distracted sewing, and that's when accidents can happen. Number three is that if your machine starts to make a funny noise, I want you to stop sewing, turn off the power, and then try to figure out what's going on and try to fix it. We always want to make sure the power is off before we do that, and we never want to sew through a funny noise, or we could hurt our project, our machine, or even worse, ourselves. And then lastly, of course, is that we want to sew at a good medium speed. The faster you go, the less control you have, the more wonky your stitches will be, but it's also more likely that something can go wrong. So if you remember those four things, we'll have a really safe time sewing. Okay, so I've threaded my machine with my blue thread. Once again, if this is something you don't know how to do, check out our e-course. It goes into all those details. And I want to set my stitch to a zigzag. So on my machine, I turn the zigzag underneath the dot. I'm going to make my length a little bit short at a 2. And I'm going to make my width probably up to like a 3, which is sort of a medium zigzag for me. So take a moment and set your machine so that you have some sort of medium zigzag stitch going on here. All right, so I'm going to zigzag around every single piece here, and for the most part I'm just going to speed it up because you don't need to watch me do everything in real time. However, I'm going to show you how I do the napkin first, because turning those corners with the zigzag can be one of those things that's a little bit tricky. So I'm going to set up my machine so that my presser foot is kind of on either side of the napkin and the placemat so that my zigzag goes back and forth. And I'm going to do all of my steps to start sewing. Take a few stitches, stop, back stitch, and then I'm going to sew on down to the corner. All right, now when I reach the corner, I want to end with my needle on the right hand side so that when I go to pivot and turn that corner, I'm ready to start sewing across this side. So I'm going to go all the way back around, making sure to back stitch when I reach the end, and then I'm going to do the same thing with all my utensils and my plate. So you may want to watch through, pause, and then you can do it yourself. All right, so now you have zigzagged all those on, or however you sew them, and I know it does take a little bit of work, but once it's on, it's super secure, and I'm loving the way the zigzags look over on this fork here. I just think that's so much fun. So you want to take your placemat that you just made and have it right side, the pretty side facing up, and then you're going to take the back piece, and you're going to put it right side facing down, so the right sides are together, and kind of be aware of where the bottom of your placemat is versus the top. For this next part, you're going to want your pins. You're also going to want your clear grid ruler and a piece of chalk. So if you have done our e-course with us, this is the same thing that we do when we make our pillow and our tulle roll up and our messenger bag, and that we're going to sew all the way around here, but leave a gap in the middle so we can turn it right side out. So to leave the gap, I like to put my hand down at the bottom and draw one little line on one side and one little line on the other, and then put in some big X's so I don't accidentally sew through them. And then I'm going to use my ruler and draw a 1/2 inch sewing line or a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around. So now is a good time to pause and catch up. So once again, if you're unfamiliar with sewing lines and seam allowances, that is something that we cover in the e-course. And then I'm going to take my pins and I'm going to put in pins all the way around the outside. I'll probably put in 2 down here, another 2 here, and like 4 across the top. All right, so once you're all pinned, we're gonna head back to our sewing machines. We're gonna change the settings, and then we're gonna sew around. Now, we're gonna start right here, back stitch, go down to my corner, pivot, 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 back here and back stitch. Again, these are terms and techniques that are covered in the Kids Learn to Sew e-course. So meet me over at the machine, we'll fix our settings and sew this together. We wanna change back to a straight stitch. If you adjusted your length, you wanna go back to between 2 or 3 or whatever your middle ground is. And if you adjusted your width, go back to 0 or whatever puts that needle back in the center for you. All right, so I'm gonna sew all the way around. My X's are behind my presser foot here. I'm gonna back stitch at the beginning, pivot at the corners, and back stitch at the end again. Watch what I do, pause, and then you can do the same. And when we're done, I'll meet you back at your prep table. Okay, so I'm back. I'm going to take out my pins. And of course, I'm going to do my double check to make sure all my stitches are on this side. And when I flip it over, all my stitches are on that side. If you accidentally went off a little bit or you're going to have a little peekaboo when you turn it right side out, now is the time to make sure your stitches go everywhere they're supposed to be. And just like anything that square rectangle that we're going to turn right side out, I'm going to cut my corners close to my line of stitching. Turn it right side out through the gap that I made and make sure all my corners and sides are nice and flat and poked out. All right, now I'm going to head back to the iron one last time. We have one more line of stitching to do to top stitch this all into place, but the very first thing we want to do is go around and press. And I want you to pay very close attention to that gap where you turned the whole thing right side out and make sure that those edges are tucked in to the wrong side so that we don't see the raw cut edges when we're done, and try to get them as even as you can. And then we're going to go around and press. You can count to 5 and then work your way all the way around. All right, so once that's all pressed, you can meet me back at your sewing machine for the final line of stitching. So this time we're going to line up the right side of our presser foot with the edge of this fabric here. And because we sewed our seam allowances at 1/2 inch, this sews it a little bit less than 3/8 of an inch. The reason that is important is as we go around, it'll catch that seam allowance and sew everything into place so that even when you wash it, it won't kind of turn into a big pillow. It'll keep that nice placemat form. So take your time with this so your stitches look nice and neat. Make sure you turn your corners and back stitch at the beginning and end. All right, you've finished. I would love to see your placemat. Please send me a photo at laura@hartfordstitch.com, or if you're on social media, you can tag Hartford Stitch. I would love to see your fabrics. I would love to see how you made it yours. I would love to see all of that. I'm so very proud of you, and I can't wait to sew with you again.